The loop that calls itself I. When you reach for a glass of water, you feel certain about one thing. You did that. You chose it. There was a self, somewhere behind the eyes, that decided, and the body followed. The choice came first. The behavior came second. The agent preceded the action. This picture is almost certainly wrong. Point at the thing that made the choice. The brain is the obvious candidate. But which part? The motor cortex executed the movement, but it was responding to signals it did not generate. The prefrontal cortex was involved in planning, but it was itself downstream of subcortical structures that had already begun biasing the decision before conscious awareness arrived. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s showed that the brain's readiness potential, the neural buildup toward voluntary movement, precedes the conscious sense of willing the movement by several hundred milliseconds. The conscious I decide appears to be a report filed after processing has already begun, not an order issued to start it. So perhaps we should point at the whole system, organism plus environment, considered together. But now we have lost the agent entirely. The whole interacting system made the choice is not a satisfying answer to the question of who is responsible. Systems do not apologize. Systems do not deliberate. And yet something coherent is happening when a person crosses a room. Something is organizing the movement. Something is, for lack of a better word, in charge. What is it? And where is it? The loop that runs itself. To find the answer, set aside the brain entirely and look at the structure of the behavior. A skilled action, walking, typing, playing an instrument, has a characteristic shape. It is not a sequence of commands executed in order. It is a loop. Action produces a result. The result is perceived. The perception informs understanding. Understanding adjusts the action. The adjusted action produces a new result, and so on, continuously, without beginning or end in any individual cycle. This is not a controversial observation. It is the basic insight of cybernetics, formalized by Norbert Wiener in the 1940s. The behavior of complex systems is governed by feedback, not by pre-programmed instruction chains. The thermostat does not run a program that says, turn on at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It senses the gap between actual temperature and desired temperature and closes that gap. The loop is the mechanism. What is distinctive about skilled human action is what happens inside the loop. Between perceiving a result and adjusting an action, there is a step that cannot be externally specified. The musician hears a note that is slightly sharp and makes an adjustment, but the precise character of that adjustment, the feel of the correction, the interpretive judgment about what the phrase requires, cannot be specified in advance by any rule. It emerges from the musician's own loop. This is what makes skill different from mechanical execution. The loop has a phase that belongs to it alone. Stafford Beer, the management cybernetician, called this autonomy, not independence from the environment, but the capacity to complete one's own governing cycle. The loop that cannot complete its own cycle is not a loop. It is a chain, and chains are pulled from the outside. Here is the first unsettling implication. The loop runs itself. There is no runner behind it. The skilled action is not produced by an agent who then executes the loop. The skilled action is the loop executing. The place we expected to find the agent, the commanding center, the initiating self, is empty. What we find instead is a self-sustaining circular process. This is not nihilism. It is a change in what kind of thing an agent is. Friction before protocol. Now imagine two people trying to do something together. Before they have agreed on any protocol, before they have discussed their respective roles, before any organizational chart has been drawn, something happens. They get in each other's way. Their independent loops produce conflicting demands on the same shared resources, the same space, the same moment, the same object. There is friction. This friction is felt before it is analyzed. Anyone who has tried to move through a narrow doorway at the same time as someone else knows this. There is an immediate, qualitative sense of interference, a bodily recognition of incompatibility, before any explicit negotiation begins. The friction comes first, and from that friction, coordination emerges, not by being imposed from above, but by being worked out from the collision itself. Two people approaching a doorway do a small spontaneous dance. One pauses, one moves, eye contact is made or avoided. A microprotocol instantiates itself and dissolves. No one designed it. It assembled from the encounter. This is the basic structure of all coordination. The musician and the conductor develop a shared sense of timing, not by following a rule, but by repeatedly feeling the moments when their loops are and are not aligned, and by adjusting in response to that felt quality. The coordination pattern is constituted from the operational loops it connects. The collective pattern is not added to the individuals. It emerges from the quality of their mutual interference. Crucially, this means that the collective is not a separate entity. It is the pattern of the coupling. When the jazz ensemble plays together, there is no ensemble that exists apart from the individual musicians and the particular quality of their interactions. The ensemble is what those interactions look like when they are well coupled. Dissolve the coupling, and you do not have an ensemble that has lost its musicians. You simply no longer have an ensemble. The collective, like the individual, is a loop pattern rather than a substance. The policy loop does not command, but surely, someone insists, there must be a governing center. There must be a level at which decisions are made, preferences are held, goals are set. This governing function exists. We can name it. In Beer's viable system model, it is called the policy function, the part of the system that holds the identity criteria, that decides what the system is for, that balances the competing demands of stability and adaptation. The policy function does exist, but it does not work the way we imagine. It does not issue commands. It does not specify what the lower-level loops should do. Beer observed this in his consulting work repeatedly. The more tightly managed a system became, the less able it was to handle variety in its environment, because the operational loops could no longer complete their own cycles. The command that replaces a loop with a chain destroys the loop's autonomy. And without that autonomy, the loop cannot do its work. The policy function's proper role is different. It holds the criteria by which the system evaluates its own behavior. It maintains the identity question, what kind of system are we? And uses that identity to balance the perennial tension between stability, keep doing what works, and adaptation, change when what works stops working. It is less like a CEO issuing directives, and more like a governing quality that pervades the whole, the thing that determines which solutions count as solutions. Consider the coordination of limb movements in walking, the specific timing patterns, the phase relationships between legs, between arms and legs, between balance adjustments and forward propulsion, emerge from the biomechanical coupling of the body's components under the constraints of the task and the environment. You do not learn to walk by memorizing phase relationships. You learn to walk by letting the coupled system find its attractor. The coordination is not planned, it precipitates. And here is what makes the policy function genuinely strange. To hold those criteria coherently, the policy function cannot remain at the level of abstract rule. It must return, repeatedly, to felt quality, to the lived sense of what the system's identity means, what it feels like to be aligned with it, what it feels like to have violated it. Organizations that maintain their identity only as formal policy, as documents and stated values, find that the policy has no traction when genuine conflict arises. The identity must be regrounded in felt belonging repeatedly, or it becomes a shell. This is not merely a management observation. It is a structural one. The governing function that loses contact with felt quality is not more rational. It is more brittle. It will hold its formal position right up until the moment it collapses, and then it will be unable to understand why. The commanding self, the one that identifies the agent with the governing center and the governing center with the issuance of rules, is the agent in crisis. It is not the paradigm case of agency. It is its degradation. Creating agents is alignment. If the agent is not a prior substance that then runs its loops, we face the question, how does the loop architecture come to exist? The answer, across multiple research traditions, converges on the same basic pattern, through the productive management of tensions. Consider how a child learns to walk. It is not by receiving a program. It is by repeatedly running the movement cycle in conditions that produce friction. The friction between the desire to move and the failure to balance, between the effort to extend and the collapse that follows, between the pattern just attempted and the proprioceptive feedback that it didn't work. Each friction is felt. Each felt friction is held long enough to produce an adjustment. Each adjustment produces a new and slightly richer movement pattern. The architecture builds itself through managed tensions. This is not unique to motor learning. It is the pattern of development in general. Piaget described cognitive development as the oscillation between assimilation, fitting new experience into existing structure, and accommodation, revising structure to fit new experience. The child who encounters a new object that doesn't quite fit their existing categories feels a productive discomfort, a disequilibrium, and the structure that emerges from resolving that discomfort is genuinely new. The architecture cannot be imposed from outside. It can only be developed from within, through the felt quality of encountered tension. The same pattern holds at the collective scale. Organizations that try to install a culture by announcing it typically find that the announcement has no effect. Culture is the pattern of how people actually behave under pressure, especially under the pressures that generate friction. It is constituted from those friction points, from how the organization handles the moments when its loops are in genuine conflict. The identity is produced by the management of tensions, not by the declaration of values. The radical implication is this: you cannot first create an agent and then align it. The alignment is the creation. The agent is not a prior substance to which loops are then attached. The agent is what loops are when they are well coupled. To build an agent is to build an aligned loop architecture, and to build an aligned loop architecture is to build an agent. These are not two steps. They are one. This has a corollary that is equally radical. The attempt to command an agent into existence, to impose the loop architecture from outside, is not just inefficient. It is ontologically self-defeating. The commanded system is not a restricted agent. It is a system that is being prevented from becoming an agent. The loop that cannot complete its own cycle is not an agent waiting to be freed. It is not yet an agent at all. The self, that is a path. What does genuine agency look like then? Not commanding. Not even exactly deciding in the traditional sense. Genuine agency looks like containment, providing conditions within which lower-level loops can complete their own cycles, while holding the criteria that make those cycles coherent as a whole. The identity that is genuinely held, continuously regrounded in felt quality, maintained through genuine encounter rather than formal declaration, open to revision precisely because it is not merely declared, is what Peirce called the agapic mode, growth through felt attraction toward viable configurations, preserving quality within structure rather than expelling quality in favor of rule. The agapic self is not the self that commands. It is not the self that decides from a position of prior certainty. It is the self that is continuously constituting itself through the quality of its loops, through the honesty of its self-audit, through the openness of its coordination with others, through the identity it maintains not by declaring it, but by living it repeatedly until it becomes the pattern that the loops return to. This self has an address, but not a fixed one. Its address is the path, the recurring movement through felt quality, genuine encounter, shared meaning, and back again. The self is not a place. It is a path that keeps returning to its own conditions of possibility,